Hi, you guys. Now, as you know, for the last few weeks, we've been, or few sessions at least, we've been having a discussion with Andrew and myself, trying to kind of dig down into a lot of the more general ideas that we've been talking about here for the first dozen classes or so, attempting to have a dialogue, a constructive dialogue about the respective perspectives of a kind of social engineer or someone who's responsible for concrete, practical policy making in a community, and on the other hand, a philosophical critic trying to keep constantly in mind the limitations of any kind of potentially absolutist theory of reality that one is trying to, in a sense, almost coercively impose upon other people. And we will directly address that. We were scheduled to start talking about that very concretely tonight, about the respective roles of those two types of people, the social engineer and the social critic. But so, given the fact that Andrew is compelled to not be here tonight because Patty Smith's playing, and she's apparently a Blakean, and so he had to go there. There's only a handful of them, so he had to go see what she had to say tonight and sing. So he's not going to be here. So I didn't want to just kind of go on ahead on that particular subject without him. So what I wanted to do is take an opportunity here to take a look at further the sort of elephant under the blanket of the course that I'm teaching here. This, as I told you, this model that we're talking about, the schematic that we're talking about, with all of its potential threats of being coercive and all of its naive assumptions that reality actually exists. That I want to go back to it and try to identify some of the underlying assumptions of the bona fides of the schematic that we're going to be talking about later again in part 3 of the course, after Andrew and I explicate as much as we can these two perspectives and help being really constructive about this, the respective roles that we have. So what I wanted to do is point out that in our discussions, you'll recall that last Friday that Andrew acknowledged or granted that talking about it from a strictly practical point of view, if one is actually trying to ascertain political solutions to political public policy problems in a given community, that a schematic of the kind that we're talking about could be very useful in that sort of mundane, practical sense. He said, as long as one does not mistake the roadmap for the terrain, which is the metaphor, that's a Buddhist metaphor of dealing with the issues of symbols. And if you're creating and utilizing symbols, you have to remember that they symbolize something that is more esoteric, that is more complex as a rule, but you can develop the use of symbols for kind of practical purposes, dialogical purposes, etc., and they can be helpful. But you have to avoid making the mistake of confusing your roadmap for the terrain. Now, what I want to do tonight is I want to propose that the roadmap that constitutes this particular schematic that I am talking about here is indeed the terrain. That it is the terrain in which reality manifests itself to human beings. And that I'm trying to say something what might be considered to be heretical, at least of this Buddhist insight, in saying that what we're talking about here is actually categorically different than a lot of other schematics that you've seen and heard about. that with adequate attention being devoted to these aspects of the schematic, and with an adequate counseling on the part of the philosophers and the social critics, one can actually get to a point where the very schematic that we're setting forth is in fact a revelation of an actual substantive dimension of reality itself. And that's what I'm putting to you tonight about this particular schematic that is, in a sense, the subject matter of the course that we're talking about. In short, what I'm proposing is that an adequately constructed 8-paradigm or 8-worldview schematic, if it's done accurately and precisely enough, tracks the actual charisms or the functioning of the prisms that are the chakras in the human body, that together function to prism reality as it is actually experienced and perceived by the individual human being who is incarnated in a biophysical form. So that this is getting back to the proposition that consciousness is, in a sense, a function of one's biophysiology, and that it's unconscious, like your unconscious mind that is talked about in psychology, that people oftentimes ignore and think that the decisions they're making are really those of their intelligent, functioning will, but that in fact there's operative beneath the conscious mind a subconscious that actually determines a good deal of what it is that you do. And it certainly influences substantially what it is you feel and think about things. And what I'm suggesting is that the radical position I'm taking is that this particular schematic that we're talking about, in fact, is designed to track the chakras in the human body, and that there's an entire subset of science and philosophy and theology and esoteric insights that in fact talk about this. And just for one example, there is this book here that I think I may have showed you before. This is the subtle energy body, a kind of a complete discussion about the history of it, the theories of it, the particular vibrational frequencies of each of the chakras. This one is by Maureen Lockhart, a PhD, who has studied all of this. And so that's what I'm basically suggesting, that in fact, if this particular schematic that we're talking about designing here is done with adequate sensitivity and concern pursuant to this particular thesis, that these particular 8 worldviews are in fact representing the actual substantive effect and charisms of the chakras. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be arguing here this evening in preparation for getting back to our discussions with Andrew, so that Andrew and I can discuss what the safeguards are that one needs to observe in constructing such a schematic and using it. And so now, even though in the Hindu tradition, for example, they assert that there are some, I think, 238 different levels of consciousness. The school of thought that I'm representing here in this discussion is saying that if you identify these 8 different nodule points along a continuum, that you can, for operational purposes, correlate a central point along the spectrum at each of these 8 nodule points that in fact is representative of the energy in the chakras. So that they really represent and represent to us categorical, political, ideological worldviews. So what I want to do is I want to get down to it in the time that we have here tonight to identify some 20 of the underlying assumptions about the efficacy of this particular model that we're talking about. Now, the first assumption of this is that there is such a thing, an actual thing as consciousness. Okay, that this is not just some meaningless abstract concept that has no correlation to reality. Now, of course, another assumption of what we're dealing with here is that there is reality. So, and we've touched upon that in our dialogue, because the theory is that if you drill down deeply enough on any particular aspect of material reality, that it disappears and it becomes a chimera and isn't real. What I'm suggesting is that's basically a load of shit. You know, that in fact you can spend all your life dealing with that kind of stuff while the rest of the world burns in front of you. You know, and you can get down to saying that, well, actually, if a little one-year-old is creeping across the street and a car is coming running at them, you know, when you really think hard enough about it, you don't really have to do anything about that. Because after all, even if they get mowed down and turned into slush, the fact is their consciousness will reincarnate somewhere else, or, you know, that it's just their karma or something. You know, that I'm suggesting that we should not agree with that. That in fact that's getting a little too obtuse and a little too abstract, and that it doesn't become operational. And so that what I'm saying is that I believe that there is such a thing as reality. We'll talk about it in a little more detail this afternoon or this evening. But that there is such a thing as reality, and that there is such a thing as consciousness. And it's not just a meaningless concept that has no application to reality. Number two, the assumption is that there are different levels of consciousness. That even though consciousness, like many other phenomena, actually manifests itself along a continuum, like light does, the frequency of light that runs all the way from infrared to ultraviolet, and just like sound, vibrational frequencies runs all the way from subsonic all the way to supersonic, and just exactly like, for that matter, smells run, you know, all the way from up to acrid, and tastes run from acrid to base. There are, in fact, continuums along which the kind of integers of experience, of these direct access experiences, these faculties that we have, that aren't things that you necessarily think directly about and control through your thoughts, but that they function automatically, like seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting. That I'm asserting that consciousness is like that it occurs directly and experientially. And like sight or hearing, consciousness manifests along a continuum. But that what I'm arguing is that there are, in fact, differing levels of consciousness along a spectrum like this. And so that you can, in fact, just like you can identify nodules along the spectrum of light, where you have what we experience as primary colors of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, etc., that we experience these primary colors as real and functional in our life. And yet, and what I'm saying is that the same thing is true of taste and smell, etc. That no matter what anybody says, the fact is chocolate tastes like chocolate. And you can feed a chocolate bar to somebody from here or in Timbuktu, and it tastes like chocolate. Now that there are, everybody's always saying, oh, who can tell what chocolate really tastes like? You can tell because if people are articulate enough and sensitive enough with their language, they can explain in verbal language, poetically at least, enough to communicate to somebody what chocolate tastes like, even if they haven't tasted it. And poets and people who are literate can do this. Okay? So what I'm saying is that there is adequate evidence, I believe, to conclude that there are, in fact, real experiences that we have. That when I see something that I believe to be a horse, and others see the thing that believes it's a horse, and you get 1,000 people together, and they look at it from every perspective, and it looks like a horse to them. It's a horse, and you can't just keep saying, well, it's not really a horse. It's kind of the manifestation of an idea of a horse that exists somewhere, abides somewhere in some ethereal realm. It's a fucking horse, okay? And so what I'm saying is that if you're into riding horses, if you're into using horses for pulling plows, if you're into getting on a horse to ride to save 100 people's lives, you want to know what a horse is, and that it's an operational horse. Okay, so I'm suggesting that this schematic that we're talking about doing is operational in that same sense. But at the same time, we're not unsophisticated, we're not ignorant and crass. It's not that we don't understand what people are saying when they raise those kind of questions. We're perfectly fluent in being able to talk about things like that. But the reality is that I'm saying is that there are different levels of consciousness, just like there are different colors, and just like there are different pure tones of sound, okay, that can be discerned by human beings in our present incarnation. And I'm saying that number 3, the assumption of this particular schematic is that consciousness is indeed a faculty, like sight or hearing, that functions to actually take in and experience certain types of data that actually exists, that isn't a figment of your imagination, isn't a function of your imagination. There's an actual objective quality to data that exists, that your consciousness takes in. And that even though this data, and this is very important to demonstrate the fact that we're not ignorant of this, is that this particular data actually exists in a potential realm of reality. That at any given microsecond, there is a certain state of reality that exists. And that's what this thesis is asserting, this schematic, that there is a reality that is manifesting itself right now, that given the fact that the ultimately irreducible energies of matter in our cosmos, these inchoate quantum fields, flash in and out of material manifestation, and that the state where they're not in material manifestation, either as a wave of energy or a particle of mass, they in fact exist in an inchoate state, a state of potential, and that in every single millimicrosecond, this occurs 1,000 times. Okay, this flashing in and out of material manifestation. But at any given point when material manifestation is manifesting in the material plane, there is in fact a reality that is manifest at that particular point. And you can close your eyes, you can plug your ears, you can stick your head in the sand, you can do anything that you want to do and pretend that therefore, since you're not seeing it, it doesn't exist, but that ain't true. The reality is that it does exist. So I'm giving you the rude awakening that the world does not exist just because you think so. And if you happen to decide you're going to think the world doesn't exist, it doesn't have any effect upon us. You can do whatever you want in that regard. But the fact is the world is going to continue in its next manifestation of reality. But we have the level of sophistication to understand that this reality obtains only for a micro-millisecond. And then the inchoate quantum fields flash out of material manifestation, and then they are in an inchoate state. And in that realm, there are multiple alternative next microseconds of reality. And in fact, we're going to talk about the relationship that exists between human intentionality and the actual form in which reality manifests itself. That consciousness is a faculty that is able to actually discern and take in data that actually exists in a realm of potential. at the next stage, so that you can experience in a given moment of consciousness a materially manifest reality that actually exists at that time, and that, but we understand that it will flash out of existence in the next micromillisecond, and therefore that previous reality doesn't exist for that microsecond. And then then reality flashes back into existence in the next millimicrosecond, but it's different. It's changed in some way. Okay, so that what we're saying is that consciousness as you experience it, experiences reality, and these realities, this data of reality, as apparently separate from yourself. That there is this experience of consciousness that experiences the data of material reality as apparently separate from your own consciousness. Okay, so that's an assumption of this particular schematic of reality, and that the insistence that I'm arguing is that the next stage of reality, the next millisecond of reality, is not exactly the same as the previous microsecond, but it comes into manifestation out of the whole realm of possibilities. Now, a big argument goes on as to whether these possibilities are infinite, or that is non-finite, that there's some absolutely endless realm of alternative possibilities for the next microsecond. I'm arguing that, in fact, there isn't. There's not an infinite number of those within the material realm, because the material realm, pursuant to this understanding, is finite. The material realm is made up of all of the sum total of the inchoate quantum fields that exist within the material universe. That the material universe is finite, that it has boundaries ultimately, that it is defined only by the existence of the affirmative inchoate quantum fields that are bound together as the cosmos, and that exterior to that, though it is consistently expanding, that exterior to that at any given micromillisecond, there is in fact out beyond that something other than material, something other than inchoate quantum fields. Yes?
Could you help us understand what a quantum field is?
A quantum field is that which has been ascertained by science now. As I mentioned, that if you take an electron, if you take an atom and you smash the atom and you separate out the protons and the neutrons and the electrons, and you take an electron, they actually take a proton, and you put it inside a particle accelerator, and you accelerate two of them toward each other, and they collide, they will break up. And you can do that so that, for example, an electron will break up into its constituent parts, and it will break up into, for example, muons. And then you take two of those muons and you accelerate them toward each other again, and they collide. They will break up into their lower constituent parts, which are like leptons. And there's an order in which all of this happens, and there are some dozens of these subparticles. But they eventually get down to a point where you take two of the smallest material forms that you can find, and you collide them together, and they will actually break into these inchoate quantum fields. They will appear to disappear from all material manifestation. But it's clear that, in fact, they remain potentially material manifestation, but they're not materially manifested. And so that they will then flash into material existence for a microsecond as, in fact, either a particle of mass or a wave of energy. And then they'll flash out of existence again, out of material existence. And so that inchoate quantum field, while it remains in a state of potential as part of material reality, it is not material reality. It's not part of material reality at that point. And so, and what they've discovered, and we touched upon it a couple different times, is that what they've discovered is that if you in tracking the way in which these inchoate quantum fields flash back into material manifestation, either as a particle of mass or a wave of energy, they've attempted to ascertain whether that happens pursuant to some sort of pattern that can be perceived. Does it alternate between mass and energy, or does it go 3 masses and then 1 energy? But there's no pattern. There's no pattern that they've been able to ascertain. But what they do realize is that if you take an individual human being, and you direct human intention toward an inchoate quantum field, in that human being intends for that inchoate quantum field, when it next manifests as an instance of matter, that it's going to manifest as a wave of energy, as distinct from a particle of mass, and that human being directs their intention to that it will in fact affect the manner in which that manifests in material reality as a wave of energy, as distinct from a particle of mass, to a statistically significant degree. This is the extraordinarily revolutionary discovery that was made back between 1923 and 1926 with all the work that was being done in the realm of quantum physics. It is what is undergirding this entire revolution that we're talking about, that's happening, that no one seems to talk to you much about. That there's this entire transition that's going on now from an assumption based upon Newtonian Cartesian physics, that the physical universe is taking place out there completely independent of what you think about it or care about it or anything at all. There is this minuscule effect, at least, that human intention can have upon a particular inchoate quantum field manifesting in the next microsecond. And so what we're saying is that, according to this schematic that I'm laying out here, is that the understanding is that if you magnify this on the part of a billion human beings, directing their attention all in a particular direction toward manifesting reality in the next millisecond, that it can have an effect upon the way reality actually manifests itself. So I just want to get this out. So that this, and it's important to point out that number 5 is that consciousness, this thing we're talking about of consciousness, is not coincident with one's intellect. The intellect, the Latin root of which is intellectus, as I've pointed out, is the ability to distinguish the difference between. And in all practical purposes, it's the ability to distinguish the difference between one thing and another thing, even one concept and another concept. It's a capacity to be able to differentiate an otherwise potentially undifferentiated set of data flowing at one. One is able to differentiate and to distinguish the difference between 2 or more phenomena. Whereas on the other hand, consciousness is simply the ability to be aware of being. It's not engaged in any type of dialectical dynamic of comparing and contrasting, noting differences between, etc. Consciousness simply is awareness of being itself, okay? Independent of any things. It's just an event that occurs, okay? In number 6, the postulate is, as I mentioned, that there are different levels or degrees of being able to experience consciousness. Just exactly as though there's different degrees of ability to see light that vary from individual to individual. Some people, for example, have 20/20 vision. That means they can see at 20 feet exactly what the average person can see at 20 feet. There are other people who have 20/200 vision. It means they can see at 20 feet, which the average person can see at 200 feet. That means that they don't see so well. There are other people who, in fact, can see at 200 feet what other people have to be 20 feet away from to see. Okay? that they have 200 vision, okay? And so that they're human beings all across the spectrum who have different capacities in being able to see light. And there's people who have different capacities of the intellect, the faculty of the intellect, of being able to distinguish between two or more phenomena and compare and contrast them. And there are people who can hear better than others. Some can hear at 100 yards, can hear something that resonates at a level of 10 decibels. Others can hear things at 100 yards that resonate at 5 decibels. Some people are even capable of hearing things that resonate at only 1 decibel at 100 yards. So there are differences in the degree to which people experience these data through their faculties. Now similarly, as I said, that this experience that you have of the intellect is a fairly simple thing. For example, when I say to you 2, 4, 6, 8, and you say, right, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And when I say to you 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, you say 60, okay? See, because you're an intelligent crowd, okay? But the ability to do that, to be able to hear the data, to be able to distinguish the difference between two integers of the data, and be able to discern the pattern in which that data is unfolding, and to be able to turn and project it into the next iteration of that sequence of reality, is in fact the intellect. And the reality is simply that there are people all along the spectrum with regard to intellect that range all the way from the single figures all the way into the high triple figures, that we set up a schematic. We set up a schematic. And people can say, well, that schematic doesn't mean anything. But it does. The fact is, a schematic has a real solid practical effect. You know, that if you want to go and help design a rocket ship to get somewhere, and you have a choice between someone who has an intellectual level of 20 on a scale of 300, or somebody that has 260 on a scale of 300, you're going to pick the person with 260 because they're more capable of exercising a particular faculty with which they are endowed. It's not that necessarily they've gotten a whole lot better training or they've just gotten a better education. The fact of the matter is the faculty with which their biological, physiological incarnation is endowed is in fact different. Okay? So I'm saying is that this particular schematic that we're talking about here postulates that the experience of consciousness, that individuated human incarnated consciousness's experience, is in fact at a different level. And that's just an objective reality that is postulated by this particular thesis. And so that now also there's also this is a big one, a big radical insight of this particular schematic, and that is that individuated human beings do actually exist. You know, that this is not a phantasm that you're having here. That this is not just some kind of thing where, you know, if I close my eyes tight enough, you all disappear. And that when you leave the room tonight, you don't just all disappear. You don't just not have any existence because you don't happen to be within my own perception range. The fact is you each have individual lives that go on completely separate. And the reality is, what I'm saying is this particular schematic that we're talking about dares to make the radical conclusion that that's true. Okay, and that we don't lapse into some type of analysis that really tries to convince me that it's legitimate for me to believe that when you leave the room you disappear. Okay, one usually gets over that when one gets to be about 3 months old. You know, that when someone goes behind a pillar, they don't disappear. That they're actually there, and we're aware of that. Little babies aren't yet. But they develop that kind of level of understanding. And so that what I'm saying is that, but as I talked about the fact that we know that reality exists, even though I've touched on here now the fact that we agree that any particular manifestation of reality exists only for a micromillisecond. And that's the most you can say at that given micromillisecond. And that it's going to manifest in the next micromillisecond differently. And that the range of potential differences that are available for the next micromillisecond are in fact in a realm of potential. That abide within this realm, that the inchoate quantum field exists in an inchoate state of non-material manifestation. Okay? And so that's what we're saying, and therefore that like individual human beings that are acknowledged, not assumed, not fabricated, not fantasized to exist, but that are acknowledged by this particular schematic to exist, that human beings exist, other things exist, like trees exist, and flowers exist, and lakes exist, and clouds exist, and continents exist, and planets exist. And so that if in fact one engages in a rational, lengthy exercise, pursuant to which one comes to the conclusion that other planets don't necessarily exist, I don't agree with that at all. I can understand, I can follow that line of reasoning into ultimate dissolution of anything rational and practical. But in fact, it usually leads to despair. It usually leads to a position where people are so despairing and despondent or completely disregarding of what's actually happening in the next material manifestation of the second, that in fact they are rationalizing not doing anything about it. That's what the problem with that particular analysis is. So what I'm saying is now that it's important now, we move on to a pivotal point which I'm acknowledging in this particular schematic, and I touched upon it briefly earlier here, and that is that this schematic takes fully into account the fact that an individual can direct her or his human intention to a given inchoate quantum field and can actually generate a statistically significant degree of influence on the next iteration of material manifestation of that particular inchoate quantum field. And that therefore there is reason to believe that the collective of our human family, by directing our collective human intentionality into the realm of the inchoate possibilities of the next iteration of reality in the next microsecond, we can actually affect that reality. And that is an assumption of this particular schematic. And very importantly, the next important step is that the level of consciousness that a person is at, which doesn't remain fixed, and I'm going to touch on that, is increasable or decreasable for that matter, but that the level of consciousness at which a person which consciousness occurs within a given collective of mass and energy that is a human being, incarnated consciousness, that the level of consciousness that is occurring has a direct correlative effect upon the degree of influence that you can have on affecting the next material manifestation of that inchoate quantum field. That is, that a being that is experiencing or there's occurring within that human being a higher level of consciousness, they can have a greater effect upon affecting the next iteration of reality and the manifestation of that particular inchoate quantum field. So that there is, as Andrew and I recognized, there is in fact an ascending factor as one moves from left to right in this particular, from right to left, as you're looking, from right to left in this schematic of worldviews and their correlative modes of spiritual expression and their levels of consciousness, their philosophies, etc., that there is an ascending factor of consciousness, and that higher levels of consciousness enable individuals who are experiencing that level of consciousness to have a greater effect upon affecting the next manifestation of reality. Okay? Now, what I'm saying is that according to this understanding, that the human body as it is incarnated by the universe, that and the interplay of any, if any, consciousness, that infinite and eternal consciousness that may abide out beyond the perimeters of the physical cosmos and pervade it by means of its presence inside each of the inchoate quantum fields in that moment in which they are consciousness, as distinct from material manifestation, that overall process that has actually generated human beings incarnates each of we human beings with an internal energy system, just like it does our vascular system and our nervous system and our other faculties. It imbues us with 8 separate energy centers that vibrate, each of which vibrates at a particular frequency, and there is a certain there are certain levels of frequency that each of these chakras vibrates at, the energy that's given off by them, that is within a certain range. And what they can tell is that these energy fields that are generated by the different chakras set up envelopes of energy, establish envelopes of energy surrounding your body, which together form a set of energy fields from within which you experience the actual prismed reality from outside. There is an actual set of interference patterns that are set up by the energy fields, so that depending upon the frequencies at which your chakras are vibrating, they set up differentiating matrices of energy around your body, and so that the actual data that we're talking about that abides in this potentiated realm actually comes to your consciousness through these prisms, and so that you genuinely experience reality differently than an incarnated being who has a different set of prisms that are functioning. Now, this is an ancient concept. It's been written about and talked about and sung about, and poems have been written about it down through the ages. And in fact, this becomes a central premise of the schematic that we're working with, even though the particular point at which we're focusing our attention, which has to do with the political philosophy of each of these 8 different worldviews that run from right to left, as I told you before, authoritarian, reactionary, conservative, moderate, liberal, progressive, and utopian, and then this potential 8th worldview that may well be generated by a chakra that abides up above the head, the full arm's length above the head, at the crest of all of the energy envelopes around your body. That this set of prisms through which you're perceiving reality can in fact be influenced if in fact you engage in certain types of conduct. if you in fact engage in certain types of breathing exercises, meditations, certain type of dietary habits, the rejecting of certain kinds of highly stimulating foods or dense red meat that is filled with certain sorts of energies of the creatures that have been killed to generate the food, etc. There's a whole panoply of knowledge that has been written about and talked about and was kept secret for 1,000 years, and that only an extremely esoteric group of people were allowed to have access to, such as yourself, here high above Logos, right? That this is a secret that has been basically made available now to the world. It's been exposed to the world, and the world remains indifferent to this for the most part. A lot of the yeah stuff. I'm too busy. I'm too involved. I don't have time for that. There's a whole range of reasons why people don't pay a lot of attention to it. But what I'm trying to do is coming to you from the outside world of operational politics, and having been involved for 45 years in a lot of the major public policy disputes that have gone on inside our country and between our country and a lot of other places in the world, I'm coming to you to at least try to communicate to you the fact that my experience has convinced me that this is true, and that I'm trying to provide a schematic by means of which you can review this reality and compare and contrast the thinking of all of the greatest thinkers of our human family down through the ages that are now available to you, and that you can compare and contrast their views with regard to this thing, and you can in fact compare and contrast the effect that it has had upon their consciousness and upon their political worldview and upon the particular policies and proposals that they set forth, all the way from Machiavelli and Hobbes, on the extreme right, working your way all across to Hegel and Nietzsche and Kant and Fichte and and St. Augustine and all of the different people that are tendered to you at one time or another as great thinkers, and that you ought to read what this person has got to say. The problem is that if it just comes at you in this whole big kind of mass of different people's opinions about different things, it's hard to make any sense out of them. They don't really tell you something in a coherent way. And that's what I'm really proposing here, is I'm proposing a methodology, a pedagogical device by means of which you can splay out in front of us all of the great thinkers and put them together in a schematic, relate them to each other, and come to understand that the reason that they concluded what they did about reality and about what we should do in light of reality is predicated upon a physiological phenomenon that they are largely ignorant of. And that therefore, while they're posturing and bloviating about their insights into reality, the fact of the matter is that those are being generated by this particular take on reality that they're experiencing through this particular matrix of prisms that are functioning in their physiology. Okay? And that what they've discovered is that if in fact people listen to a certain portion of the human family that are almost universally recognized as somehow having something extraordinarily important to say to the human family. The saints and prophets down through the ages have been peculiarly recognized in their own lifetimes or soon thereafter as having been saying something to people that is of absolutely extraordinary value, even though they're ignored and shunned and ridiculed and often persecuted and killed during their own lifetime, or at least up until the end of their lifetime. And so that this is something that what I'm trying to say is that I want you to have available to you at least this particular insight, that if you become familiar with this particular schematic and you become sensitive to all of the nuances of it and the deep philosophical insights that reside within the thinking of these people who are here, the human family that has gone before you, on whose shoulders you stand at this point in time, to come to grips with what it is that's going to be happening during your life. This thing that's going to be happening during your lifetime, as I say, I do not despair of this. I do not believe that the amount of carbon that has been put into the atmosphere up to this point makes it absolutely irreconcilable with anything other than total absolute catastrophe. There's no doubt in my mind that it's going to be serious, and that the consequences are already inevitably going to be quite serious. Okay, but the fact of the matter is, over the period of the next 10 years, dramatic steps can be taken to try to lessen the catastrophic nature of what it is that's going to happen with regard to global climate change. And you can see, as I said, rolling into place all of the tools of a national security state to attempt to lock down on people in the event that these types of disruptions start to occur. The breakdown of the economic structure, the breakdown of law and order, the breakdown of the food supplies, the water supplies, etc. That this national security state, this continuity of government thesis that has been developed by the elite under the rubric of the living through a thermonuclear exchange, which in and of itself is pretty ridiculous. I mean, that the exchange of all of the thousands of nuclear warheads that are possessed by the Soviet Union and ourselves, and China has more than 24 now. If there were a thorough exchange of these nuclear weapons and stuff, the whole idea of coming back out and sort of reconstituting the American government right now under the continuity of government theory is preposterous. But still they go ahead and do it. And yet they don't stop doing the things that constitute the threat itself. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm trying to get you to understand that the study of the great thinking of our human family requires some kind of coherent organizing principle, pursuant to which you can comprehend what they're all saying respectively, and you can evaluate what you think about what they're saying. Not just one philosopher at a time here and there, but in some kind of comprehensive overall way. And so what I've done is I've laid out for you, and we have the videos of those earlier presentations so that you can see what it is. We will cover it in more detail after we get done with part 2 of the course here, where Andrew and I are going back and forth trying to explore and probe to really determine whether or not each of us at least understands, is knowledgeable of, and at least understands what it is that the other person is saying, and trying to take into account the value of what it is they're saying, so that I, on the one hand, am perfectly cognizant of the dangers of any type of schematic that purports to be reflective of truth itself. And on the other hand, Andrew, who is sounding the alarm and pointing out that in fact one has to necessarily try to eschew almost any given assertions about reality, but for the mere kind of mundane practice of practicality and saving the world, if that can be done. But Andrew, we have to talk about this more, but Andrew seems to be surprisingly convinced that there's no saving the world. There's no saving the world from thermonuclear catastrophe. There's no saving the world from massive catastrophic effects of global climate change. And so, therefore, what one needs to do is engage in a form of art and literature and philosophizing, which is speaking out in the face of the onrushing catastrophe. So we need to discuss that more, he and I, to make certain that we fully understand what each other is doing. And I don't get perceived by Andrew as a person who's a kind of an implicit authoritarian that's wanting to figure out how to foist reality on people and lock them down into one way of viewing things. Simply because we're faced with an exigent circumstance of emergency. That's not what I'm saying. And on the other hand, I don't want to perceive what Andrew is saying as suggesting that he is abandoning all hope, even though he may say so upon occasion. I remember when I met what's his head, the guy that used to drive the big red Cadillac and from Las Vegas, what's his name? Hunter Thompson. That I was asked. Bobby De Niro asked me to go out to Aspen to make a presentation to a bunch of people about the Iran-Contra thing and all the secret stuff that we knew about what was going on, et cetera. And we were out there at the place with the guys that run the Roots Shoes that were sponsoring it. And along comes Hunter Thompson, and he comes driving in his great big huge Cadillac. Peels a big Brody in and climbs out and put down more cocaine in 2 hours than anybody I've ever seen. I figured it would knock over a horse. But anyway, he was just snorting it down and he was going on and on. And I started talking with him about some of this stuff. And it became very clear to me that while he gave off all of the kind of signs of being a completely despairing nihilist, the fact of the matter is that he was a broken-hearted idealist. And that I do not want your hearts broken. Okay? I want you to understand that you can be idealistic and not be stupid, not be fuzzy-headed, not be mush-brained. The fact of the matter is you need to train your intellect to the highest possible level and train your consciousness and your physiology to the highest possible level in order to engage what's coming, okay? And that's the kind of, for lack of a better word, cadre that I would like us to be able to develop. And so that's what this schematic is really all about. And those are a dozen or so of the major underlying factual and theoretical assumptions that go into making up this particular schematic. And we'll touch upon some of the particulars of the schematic and which philosophers and which moral theologians and which political theorists, etc., fit into each one of the particular worldviews, so that I will be able to, I hope, demonstrate to you how practical and effective this particular schematic is of taking into account all of the thinking of all of the great thinkers that we can figure out. And so that even when you find a new one or a different one that we haven't yet taken into account, with some modicum of discussion among ourselves, we can all say, oh, right, this guy's a classic fifth paradigm political theorist. And then you compare them and contrast them with others in that realm, and then evaluate what it is they're saying. That's what I'm hoping we can do. Okay, so that's the presentation that I wanted to make, just given this opportunity that we have of a short interstices here between the conversations that Andrew and I are having. The fact of the matter is, with regard to the vibrational frequencies of color, there's actually tens of thousands of colors if you move just along the continuum. That what happens, however, is that there are some kind of peculiar events that occur along the spectrum of light that cause us to be attracted to and see these primary colors, where a certain point is reached between, for example, the color of red and green that seems distinctively orange. And that what I'm saying is that it's analogous to that, that these worldviews come together in a way that kind of lock into place. And what I'm suggesting is that the reason that 8 of them seem to occur is because we have these 8 chakras that generate these sort of charisms that resonate at a particular frequency. And what they do is they tend to be drawn into attention to a place where those frequencies resonate with them along these. All of this is vibration. This is all vibrational frequencies.
Is there spectrums within the individual worldviews too?
Well, there's certainly, well, there are, but in fact they don't have the kind of appeal in they don't generate the resonance among people when they're away from the kind of the high focal point. When they're at that high focal point, what they do is they maximize the number of people responding out of their chakra energy centers to resonate with that particular view. Okay, so that surely it's just like saying, are there people who in a group can sing more on tune than others? Yes, there are. But what I'm suggesting is you take 1,000 people in a potential audience, and they'll all end up gravitating to just certain people who have their own individual little room where they're singing, and they'll go into one of these rooms and they'll go, excuse me, that person is really off tune. And then they'll go until they actually get to a room where there's a person that's resonating at a particular frequency, and then they'll like that. There's a natural thing that happens with people. This is all natural, that what I'm talking about. Okay, so certainly there are nuances inside those worldviews, but when they get to a certain specific focal point, they're very clear and they're very effective, and that they will mobilize people who are dominated by a particular energy center. That's what will happen, you know. So if you get a pure reactionary, a real clear, pure second paradigm reactionary, you know, speaking to a major audience, and the people who are dominated by a second chakra energy field are going to just kind of flock to that person because they feel comfortable. There's a harmonic resonance that is established with them, and that's why they follow them. You know, and the same thing is true all the way up the spectrum. That what this has to do with, that what this whole schematic has to do with is advocacy. That the people here along the spectrum, what I'm proposing is that they be free and encouraged to advocate what their worldview is and what the subcomponent beliefs are that they have, in an attempt to persuade people to participate in this. And you remember that my reply to Andrew's question or your question actually, is where would it come out practically? And how it comes out practically is that if you have a community where every person, once they're exposed to the advocacy of these people, are allowed to vote and allowed to choose what the particular solution is they want to use to address a particular public policy problem after they've heard all of the dialogue and all of the worldviews articulate what their analysis of the problem is and how it should be resolved, then you have to have a very important process, a democratic process by means of which the individual people who are affected by the policy get to choose what to do. And that's how you overcome the dangers of the authoritarian mode of this thing. And it's essential because the degree of conviction, of certainty that each one of the advocates has is inclined to cause them to want to make the people do it. You know, and then you start getting that type of authoritarian quality to it. But as I said, and I just wanted to be completely honest, that even that having been said, there is a form of kind of coerciveness in the person's advocacy, because the person is standing up in front of you telling you that this is true. And the fact of the matter is that whatever the resonance is, or the degree of bond that you have with the person, of trust, that's imposing upon you a sense of burden of having to do that. Okay, so in that sense, it's coercive. But that's why as you move from the right to the left, what you do is you start to discover that the people tend to be less and less coercive, that they're more advocational. And the point is that the classic mystics that just walk around being, and making themselves available, and they'll answer questions when people ask them. They won't go standing on soapboxes and narrating and ordering people around. They just answer people's questions when they want to hear about it, and then they're either persuasive or they're not. So that's how you solve that danger. Well, it would have to be at the stage where every person was in a state of complete unity, and that each and every person, therefore, was engaged in a process of making those kind of decisions that were the ideal decisions for the whole community, without any kind of need for dialogue or discourse or any of that. The minute you engage in dialogue and discourse, you start to insert some quality of coerciveness, an ability to persuade, to cajole, to get people to do something, that it starts taking on that quality. But there probably is some worldview farther on. That it's my opinion that the eighth paradigm worldview, the eighth paradigm human worldview, that where we open and activate that eighth chakra above our head, is very possibly the root chakra or bottom chakra of an entire other octave of being, and that's their bottom chakra, and that they're beings of light and a lot more ethereal and a lot less coercive and in higher consciousness, etc. And so that I assume there are octaves of these dimensions of materiality. Oh yes, oh yeah, I do. Because as I say, that this whole thing has to do with vibrational frequencies, and the whole concept of coherence has to do with attraction and bonding, and that these resonant frequencies, like for example, the classic sympathetic vibration of striking a tuning fork here, in that you have a tuning fork of the same frequency at the other side of the room, and you touch this thing, and it'll go, and that one will start vibrating. You see, there's a resonant frequency that gets established, and so that I believe that in fact the different actions that the cosmos may be engaging in, that a particular one that's functioning, that's real, is going to set up a harmonic that is going to cause a specific teleology to unfold. You see, so that it is generic to the cosmology, in the same way that the ontological phenomenon that is generated by that particular set of reality is in fact derivative of that teleology. And so what I'm saying is that the ability to discern it on the part of a given individual has an awful lot to do with, dare I say it, the state of their vibrational frequencies. That there are in fact certain ideal frequencies at which each one of the chakras can vibrate, and that there's stuff written about it, and there's a strange degree of agreement among the different cultures about this thing, that have ascertained that there's a particular frequency of each of the chakras once it's established in a given person that resonates at an ideal frequency. And so that there's a whole set of 8 of them that have an ideal frequency, each one of them, so they would end up having kind of an ideal matrix that is generated by the interface of all of those. And then they would probably be able to very simply and clearly have not only a completely coherent worldview, but that it would tend to comport more with reality at a given microsecond. Okay? And they'd be open to experiencing the changes in the reality from microsecond to microsecond. They're open completely to it. But the fact is that to the extent to which we don't know definitively the answer to those fundamental questions of cosmology and teleology and ontology and epistemology, to the extent to which we don't know the answers yet, what people do is they project out algorithms. They come to certain conclusions, intuitive conclusions, which I might suggest are a function of their biophysiology. And they're being completely honest. I mean, that's their intuitive instinct because there's no direct proof of it. And so everybody, in effect, is functioning from their intuition about what the answer to that is. And so they have a very genuine intuition of that. And once they get an intuition of that, they can logically discern what is harmonious with that with regard to the answer to all the other questions. So they can have a completely and totally consistent worldview, even though it may not comport with reality in an ultimate sense. We don't know it. We don't know whether it does or not yet because we don't know the definitive answer to those things. But I do believe, yes. And the fact is, to state it simply, you can tell it when you see it. When there's somebody there that has a full scale, locked on worldview that is completely consistent, they have an answer for virtually every single thing you want to ask them. And it goes down as deep as you want to drill and as high as you want to go, and they've got an answer for it. And that's why they know how to, and that's why it has the danger of being authoritarian. Okay? So, but I do very sincerely believe that they can. But again, as I say, I believe that the matrix of the interaction and interplay of the chakra energy sheaths in the body have such an effect upon what your intuitive perceptions are that it's a function of those. So that you start to have an intuition that this saint who you see and you admire and you resonate with is telling you that, your chakras are a little out of phase here. If you might do this. I'm not telling you have to, but you might not continue to eat meat, for example. You might do your meditations a little more rigorously, and they tend to suggest things like that. And then when you start to do that, you start to feel yourself getting into a higher and higher frequency, and then your worldview becomes more coherent, I believe. The fact is that a person who has a super dominating third chakra, for example, they're heavy into the power chakras and stuff like this. I mean, for example, did you ever see 7 Days in May? There are certain scenes like where Burt Lancaster will come walking into the room in character. People used to talk about this all the time. And he come walking into a particular room, and everybody in the whole room would just drop right into just watching him, listening to him, figuring out what he's doing. Because he's got this powerful third chakra. He's got this major power center. And some people are more or less appealing in that particular regard. But he was quite appealing. But he had an extraordinarily highly developed third chakra. And people could tell that. For example, 300, the movie, 300, that guy's a classic second chakra guy. Standing on the edge of the cliff, basically shouting out his power and dominance against the Persians, representing his people, protecting his people against the dialectical other. And he's the pure article. He's right down on it. And the fact is that everywhere he goes, he draws people into sympathetic resonance with his energy frequency. That's what happens. Just like a tuning fork, like that. So,
yeah, I'm curious.
the tactical, in my opinion, the tactical step to take with people in the first paradigm is to try to elevate them from the lower manifestation of the paradigm into its higher manifestation, so that they move from being authoritarian to being authoritative. One of the classic examples of this. Did you see what was the name of that? First Night with Sean Connery and who was the other guy that was in the First Night? Richard Gere, and Joanna, somebody that played Guinevere and stuff like this. That great writers and directors know how to find people that can portray characters because they have a certain kind of energy, right? And so Sean Connery played Arthur. And Arthur was portrayed as a classic authoritative but not authoritarian character. And so that he was charismatic and magnetic and asserted authority etc. But he was constantly utilizing his authority to establish an order that was beneficial to everybody. So that there are all kinds of cultural settings in which an authoritative leader is the only possible kind of leader that can be effective in that culture. That's clearly absolutely true in time and place. And that those type of leaders are the kind that can move their people from a place to a place of greater advantage. And so that's how you do it. And the same thing is true of second paradigm people. You find a second paradigm fundamentalist who's into kind of waging war against the ultimate other. You know, the idea is to try to move them up into the higher manifestation of the second paradigm so that it's more Taoist. That there's actually an understanding of the yin and the yang and the alpha and the omega, that there's a dance of the antipodal energies that taken together can set up an overtone of cooperation. You know, that's sort of what Andrew and I are doing is trying to have a type of Taoist dance between the social engineer and the philosophical critic. You know. Okay, so I don't want to keep you guys forever here. It's now 20 minutes to 9. So if there's anybody else got any pressing questions, then we'll tie it up. Yeah.
Back to some ideas.
That's a classic fifth paradigm social form. Okay. The fifth paradigm social form is sort of egalitarian democracy. The challenge becomes is the danger of that is the authoritarianism of the mob. Is that if you have a complete majority that decides that the 90% of the people that are white ought to own the 10% that are black, whether comes the source of resisting that? What's the normative principle that you have to raise to say, look at that you as the majority don't have the right to do certain kinds of things, and so that you have to have an entire mode of ethical reasoning that postulates these fundamental rights on the part of the individual over and against the collective. And so that becomes a sixth paradigm. You move into a sixth paradigm, more idealistic position from the liberal fifth paradigm into the idealistic sixth paradigm, where you start to illuminate and elucidate fundamental rights, and they come from a natural law theory that grants a much more central role to the intuitive dimension of discernment than to a rational, strictly utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning. So that's how you do that. Okay, thank you, you guys. Sorry for the big dose of lots of technical details, but I want us to get ready for Friday with Andrew. Okay, thank you.